Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore what the practice of meditation can contribute to psychology. However, even at the outset, we're faced with two semantic problems. One has to do with defining what meditation is, and the other has to do with defining what psychology is. What makes defining meditation tricky is that there are many different ideas about what it actually is. For some people, it's a relaxation technique. For others, it's a kind of imaginative visualization exercise. And for still others, it's a vehicle for personal and/or spiritual growth. Basically, in this video, I'll be talking about the kind of meditation that I practice personally, which is derived mostly from Zen and Tibetan Buddhism. This kind of meditation is mostly about simply sitting in silence and allowing our awareness to follow our breath. Of course, for most of us, this turns out to be quite a bit trickier than it seems at first. That's mostly because our consciousness is not very used to silence. What it's used to is being filled with all kinds of clamorous thoughts, desires, worries, memories, sensations of entertainment and boredom, etc., etc. In Buddhist practice, we call this monkey mind. In other words, normally our minds are a lot like crazy little monkeys, frantically bouncing from tree to tree, trying to get a hold of the next banana, and then the next, with only the faintest glimmer of self-awareness. And it takes a special anomalous moment in our everyday consciousness to break out of our monkey mind and allow ourselves simply to be with ourselves, without distraction, without entertainment, without the usual clamorous avalanche of thoughts and sensations that fill our awareness. The kind of meditation I practice is about allowing those anomalous moments to happen. That is, allowing ourselves to become still and quiet on the inside, and in that stillness, allowing ourselves to experience the present moment in its fullness. And ultimately, it's about allowing the illusory selves that we normally think we are to dissolve and wash away, and permitting a very different sense of ourselves to come to the fore. As Shunryu Suzuki puts it with his usual poetic panache, meditation of this type is about dying as a small being, moment by moment. But how could all of this be relevant to psychology's project? Well, it seems to me that part of the answer has to do with how we define psychology. If, as some people believe, psychology is limited to a kind of natural science inquiry into behavior and mental processes, then meditation becomes just another behavior we adopt because of a particular sequence of reinforcements and associations. Or perhaps just another pattern of neural activity, or just another type of cognition. And yes, we can say some interesting things about meditation from each of those perspectives. However, the point of meditation is not merely to serve as a basis for saying interesting things about X, Y, or Z. The real point is to deepen how we ourselves actually experience life. So I would say that the first contribution of meditation to psychology is to invite psychology to broaden its project, to make it much more actively participatory, where our consciousness and capacity for self-awareness are not merely objects of intellectualized abstraction, but a way of living. However, it also seems to me that being able to see meditation that way is much easier from the perspectives of some schools of psychological thought than it is from others. Basically, it's much easier from the perspectives of those schools of psychological thought that place a priority on understanding actual subjective experience. Schools like phenomenological, existential, and humanistic psychology. These types of psychology all aver that there are many important things that we won't really understand, at least not in any genuine or powerful way, until we have actually experienced them. That subjective experience itself is the ultimate source of psychological insight. So, with that in mind, what does practicing meditative consciousness have to contribute to psychology? One important area of contribution has to do with how we think about and define some of psychology's basic constructs. Let's look at 4 such constructs: intelligence, freedom, sanity, and the self. Intelligence, of course, has been an area of perennial concern for psychologists pretty much since psychology's nascence in the late 19th century. So, how do psychologists typically conceive of intelligence? One way of answering that question would be to look at the kinds of tasks typically found in psychological IQ tests. Side note. Be very wary of practically all of the measures of IQ found in popular culture. They're almost all little more than glorified clickbait with very little statistical validity. But back to our question. What kinds of tasks can we find on the kinds of IQ tests employed by clinical psychologists? Well, they all measure problem solving, especially with regard to speed and accuracy. And they all measure the amount of generalized knowledge a person has. And they all measure proficiency with language, as well as the general capacity of memory. In other words, IQ as a psychological construct is basically about how full and how active our minds are. However, from the point of view of the kind of meditative consciousness I'm describing here, intelligence is something very different. It's much more about how empty and still, and hence how receptive our minds can be. That's because a mind that's overly full and always whirring frenetically is not a mind that's likely to perceive the reality of the present moment clearly and accurately. Nor is it likely to respond to the demands of the present moment harmoniously. So, it turns out that from a meditative perspective, what we commonly regard as intelligence, how full and active our minds are, is actually a form of stupidity disguised as cognitive agility. In other words, our usual psychological conception of intelligence is actually a deviation from its true nature. And the same basic thing holds true for our ideas about freedom. Here I would say that the most common way of thinking about freedom is in terms of what I like to call commodified freedom. In other words, most of the time we think about freedom much like we think about going shopping. Let's say we go to the supermarket where we find a long aisle of breakfast cereals, and basking in the warm, almost sybaritic glow of commodified freedom, we think to ourselves, hallelujah, I'm free to choose Lucky Charms or Fruit Loops or Cheerios, or perhaps, if I'm feeling just a little bit audacious, Count Chocula. God bless America, land of the free, home of the brave. In other words, we think of freedom mostly in terms of having a range of options from which we can pick what we want. However, from a Buddhist meditative perspective, all of that is little more than how we're imprisoned within our desires themselves. In other words, how our way of attaching and clinging to what we think we want is itself a form of enslavement. Think about it. If you really need a box of Fruit Loops, or perhaps a new pair of shoes, or maybe a big ticket item like a BMW in order to feel good, well, at some point it becomes difficult to say who's really the master and who's really the slave in the commodified relationship. Probably the slave is the one who's working every day to pay off the resulting credit card debt, which is how most of us live. But if real freedom isn't that, then what is it? Well, from a meditative perspective, freedom is really about our ability to adapt ourselves to whatever life is showing us, whether it accords with our desires or not. In other words, real freedom isn't so much about getting what we want, but about wanting what we get. That's because the obvious and inescapable reality is that sometimes we'll get what we want in life and sometimes we won't. So freedom is really about our ability to navigate that reality easily and harmoniously. Consequently, as in the case of intelligence, it turns out that the psychological construct of freedom is something very different from what we usually take it to be. And the punchline to the joke is that what we commonly regard as freedom is actually a form of enslavement. Okay, now let's look at sanity. Here again, meditative practice yields a perspective that's very different from a conventional one. For instance, it's fairly common among beginners in meditation, those of us who are just starting to become mindfully aware of how our consciousness is working, to realize with some degree of horror just how chaotic and jumbled and incoherent our subjectivity is a lot of the time. True, we may be wearing the right clothes and saying the right things at the right times in order to conform to our world's prevailing customs and conventions, but on the inside, the unsettling reality is that most of us are actually stark, raving lunatics most of the time. For instance, if we're honest about it, we'd have to admit that our minds are full of all kinds of inane crap. Silly, old TV episodes, factoids about celebrities whose lives are completely irrelevant to our own, commercial slogans and jingles hyper-repeated until they're droning idiotically in the innermost recesses of our awareness. And not only that, most of us are full of all kinds of glaring contradictions and inconsistencies. We tell ourselves we believe in one thing, and 15 minutes later, we're doing the exact opposite. We lie to ourselves all the time about big things and small things. And when we're not lying, we're often kowtowing to other people's hollow tin gods for no good reason, trying to live out other people's values for them so that other people won't reject us, conforming to ways of life that are not genuinely our own and losing sight of our souls in the process. In fact, when you think about it, there are actually very few people on planet Earth who aren't just plain raving madmen. It's just that most of us have been taught to conform to a false concept of sanity, where our society's prevailing pathologies look like a recipe for health and prosperity. But in reality, that sort of conformity is mostly about encouraging a pathological state of alienation, an alienation from the deeper latencies of life, a thoroughgoing estrangement from existence, from the reality of being, and ultimately from our own souls and deeper destinies. And perhaps the most obvious marker of all of that is how difficult and uncomfortable it is for a lot of us simply to be with ourselves, without distraction, without entertainment, without the cacophony of voices and images and desires that typically fill our world. Simply sitting with ourselves in silence, perhaps for long periods of time. But, of course, it takes a special act of reflective awareness to become cognizant of all of that, and ultimately to move a little closer to actual sanity. And here again, as in the cases of intelligence and freedom, meditative consciousness invites us to realize a much deeper meaning for sanity, as well as for related constructs like madness, psychological disturbances, disorders, syndromes, etc. Again, it turns out that what we think of as sanity is most of the time simply a form of socially sanctioned madness. Surprise! However, it seems to me that perhaps the deepest contribution that meditative awareness can make to psychology has to do with the way we think about the self, with our sense of identity, or in other words, our answer to the question, who are we? But how is that possible? Well, consider how we normally conceive of the self. Basically, mostly in terms of a composite of various historical facts, future projections, beliefs, habits, attitudes, values, etc., which we use to define ourselves and our relation to the world. In other words, we usually think of ourselves mostly in terms of a list of various attributes, a list of things that we could reasonably put on an expanded and more personal version of our resumes, with the same basic structure as a resume. However, from the perspective of meditative consciousness, the question very quickly becomes, is that who we really are? That's because when we experience meditative consciousness, it becomes apparent that who we think we are is simply what we happen to be clinging to at present. In other words, it's a function of what we're attached to. And it also becomes apparent that we could actually let go of our personal investment in that attachment at any time. Basically, it becomes obvious that what we really are is actually far more optional, malleable and transient than the self as we normally think about it is. In fact, it eventually becomes apparent that there is no self, at least not in the usual sense, at all. All of that's really just a kind of mirage, a kind of theater we perform for ourselves and the world. And it's at best a very partial and incomplete picture of who and what we really are. From the point of view of meditative consciousness, the self is actually much more like a locus of alteration and change, more like an opening where we're always slipping into something beyond ourselves, sometimes very gradually and subtly, and sometimes very suddenly and dramatically. So the self is not merely a structure that provides our lives with a stable self-definition and coherent sense of orientation of the world. Rather, the self, in its deep sense, is about how we actively participate in the larger, ever-undulating sea of universal transcendence. And one of the many benefits of meditative consciousness is that it can help us to realize that actuality and then help us to learn to live accordingly. Which, of course, is much easier said than done. Since this can perhaps sound and be a little bit abstract, let me illustrate it by way of a personal example. As my own meditative practice has deepened over the years, I find that I'm gradually letting go of my attachments to how I used to define myself. For instance, I no longer think of myself as a college professor, even though that's my job. Of course, the label of college professor describes the position I occupy within the socio-cultural matrix, and in any number of related ways too. However, personally, I no longer think of myself as a professor in the sense that that role would define who I am. Similarly, I no longer think of myself as male, as white, as 58 years old, as American, or even as Eric Dodson. So, am I fleeing from the facts that constitute the reality of my life? By no means. I'm simply recognizing, little by little, that who and what I am is far deeper than any of these categories, and far deeper than the sum total of them too. Sure, all of that kind of stuff is inevitably part of life as we know it, and it also situates all of us within the larger social matrix. But over time, I've come to realize that it's not actually the most fundamental and important fraction of who and what I am, or what any of us are for that matter. Who I really am underneath it all is, well, no one special. Just another wanderer, just another nomad borne upon the currents of time and space that surround us. Another tiny droplet of humanity falling from the clouds in the raging thunderstorm of life. Just another fractal image caught in the kaleidoscope of universal transcendence, ceaselessly reconstellating itself like the stars in the midnight sky, beyond category, beyond definition, beyond words and the various roles we play and take so seriously. And this brings us to perhaps the final contribution that meditative consciousness can bring to psychology's project, or at least the last one I'll talk about in this video. And that's the idea that the point of psychology is not merely to understand the human psyche from a distant, spectating position, but from the point of view of our fundamental involvement in life. After all, the whole point of cultivating meditative consciousness is to increase our ability to experience the depth of the present moment and to inhabit the moments of our lives more fully and more faithfully, and eventually to heighten our entire experience of life itself. And so, why shouldn't psychology's project seek to incorporate that same deep sense of participation and existential adventure into its own ambit? Why should we be content with merely understanding consciousness and other facets of our existence in an aridly intellectualized way? After all, isn't the deep point of understanding things to intensify our actual experience of their reality? And if that's true, wouldn't the most profound kind of psychological adventure inhere in meeting the challenge of human existence with the greatest sense of engagement possible? To take up life, as a daring adventure, the kind that calls for real verve and real courage and real zest and passion, with a full and cognizant participation of all that life is. Isn't that the real point of human self-understanding, both meditative and psychological? To turn our time into this world into one prolonged and sacred act of lovemaking. To live upon the blossoming of an uncertain flower, as one of my more thoughtful students once put it. Well, thanks for watching. Peace out.